So welcome, everyone. I'm Alistair Donald. I'm the co-convener this year for the Battle of Ideas Festival. It's 2 months since the festival started. Seems like a long time ago. We started with a debate on the future of cities, and in the 2 months since, we've had I think around about 150 different debates on every conceivable topical issue that's important in the world today. I'm very pleased to say that we're going to conclude the 2023 festival with this discussion on the politics of hate, because I think over the past decade or so, hate has become one of the most important issues, and it's very much, I think, going to continue to be a very important issue in the period ahead. We're hosting this discussion at a time when in London there's a march currently taking place where the police have been handing out leaflets guaranteeing absolute clarity on arrestable offences. The Met Deputy Assistant Commissioner says they'll not tolerate anyone who spreads hate speech. And if we think, I don't know how much you've been following the events in Dublin this week, but some of you might have noticed the response from the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, who said...
Fine by me.
That's hate speech, Alistair.
Right, arrested. His response to the riots was he pledged to modernise laws against hatred. And I think the interesting thing, just to use this as an example of some of the things that we're dealing with, a couple of interesting things. Hate has become really a way of explaining events. I mean, something as complicated as the situation in Dublin this week, where there was attempted murders and a response that takes in the politics of immigration and all sorts of other things, is reduced and boiled down to this question of hate. And secondly, the response is to try and legislate around it. And I think more and more we're seeing attempts to reorganize legislation, law, the public sphere more generally around these questions of hate. So I really hope that we can get to grips with this issue. And just to say, this is a complex discussion, I think, going back to the opening remarks this morning, because I've noticed, and I'm sure that some of you have, that some of the people who seemed concerned about free speech only a few months ago seem to be not so concerned just now, because in the context of the Israel and Palestinian question, whereas some of the critics of hate legislation, long-standing, seem to be much more open to their introduction these days in terms of wanting to clamp down on protesters and so on and so forth. So I think this is a nuanced and complex issue, and I hope we can try and untangle this issue of the rise of hate, answer why it's become such a focus, and think about how it is that we should respond to it. And what are the prospects, really, for making a society where political exchange is somewhat less toxic and a bit more productive. So, to introduce my panel in the order that they're going to speak, on my far left, we've got Dennis Hayes, who's Professor of Education at University of Derby. You would have seen him this morning because University of Derby are our partners for today's event. So very pleased to have Dennis here. Dennis is the founder of and the director of Academics for Academic Freedom. You might have noticed that they're a very rapidly expanding organisation. There seems to be barely a week goes by without them announcing a new branch opening. I think their latest one is Sheffield.
And Dublin next.
And Dublin. 2 branches a day. And he's the co-author of a best-selling book, The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. Next, we'll be hearing from my immediate right, Ike Edgy, who's a practicing architect. He's a lecturer at various different schools and universities throughout the UK and Europe. He's the head of housing architecture and urban space at the think tank Policy Exchange. In a very different context from the world of hate, he's the author and contributor to a series of essays, 5 critical essays on beauty, which was published by Critical Subjects. And probably most important for this debate, he's one of the founding signatories for Don't Divide Us, which is the UK's common sense voice on race and overcoming racial divides. So welcome to you, Ike. Then we'll be hearing from, on my left, Liz Kershaw, who's a broadcaster and writer. According to her Twitter account, Liz is mad about music, passionate about politics. I think we're getting passionate Liz today rather than mad Liz, but this is Battle of Ideas, so you never know. I'm sure you've all switched on the radio and the telly and heard Liz covering music or politics, current affairs. She currently writes for The Telegraph as a columnist and is a regular there. So welcome to you. And then finally, on my far right, we're going to hear from Andy Shaw, who's the co-founder of Comedy Unleashed, the free speech comedy club that has earned a reputation for hosting comics that have been cancelled or banned, meaning that he's often got to defend himself from accusations of not online hate, but on-stage hate. The Times says Comedy Unleashed is the comedy night that takes PC out of the stand-up elite. And the appetite for that sort of comedy is evident, I think, because not only do they run a very long-standing club every month in London, but they've now opened a branch in Leeds as well. So that's Andy. Can we give them a big warm round of applause? You know the format. They're going to give quick opening speeches, then it's going to come straight out to you for your questions and points, and we'll kind of to and fro across the course of the next hour. So, Dennis, do you want to kick us off, please?
Who are the real bigots? Those who will not change their views, even if what they defend is hateful. Who? It's you, the audience, and those on the panel. You're all uncompromising defenders of free speech. And as what you are defending is just hate or a liberal veneer over hate. Promoting this conference as a space where free speech is allowed on social media, I got two sets of comments. One is free speech will just descend into hate speech. And you only want free speech because it's an excuse to abuse the vulnerable and the oppressed. This is the weaponization of the idea of hatred against free speech. And there are academics, politicians, legal experts and trade unionists who think free speech is hate speech. I had the pleasure of debating at the Cambridge Union with one American academic called Gavin Titley, who explicitly says this. If you promote free speech and discuss any controversial issue, like race, you're an oppressor, and you're promoting hate speech. And there are others who think that no platforming, like stopping people's speech, is necessary as it protects the vulnerable against hate. Evan Smith's book reviewing the whole of no platforming. We now have laws about hate speech in the UK and elsewhere, and about to be implemented in a frightening way in Ireland. And I thought Alistair was going to pinch all my lines here, because they're going to introduce the first ever hate speech legislation. And the Taoiseach has just said he's going to make it even stronger. But in the Criminal Justice Incitement to Violence and Hatred Act, hatred is not defined. It's defined circularly, if anything, that hate is anything which produces hatred. Right, that's going to be good. So who's going to be left to decide what is hatred in Ireland? The police. Right. So we have here, you're all familiar with the notorious invention of non-crime hate incidents. Yeah? And of course the online safety bill with legal but harmful speech. And it always raises me a question, academics for academic freedom took freedom within the law out of our statement, because there are so many laws restricting free speech. So many people will say, I support free speech within the law, and they turn a blind eye to all the laws that undermine free speech. But there are three aspects to this weaponization of hate. First of all, it aims to silence, right, and often violently silence. Secondly, it has a very diminished view of the groups that they're proposed to defend. And thirdly, it appeals to the authorities or to the state to intervene. You may be aware of Edinburgh Academic for Academics Freedom's experience of trying to show the film Adult Human Female over the last year. The vilification and the attacks on those women, mostly the women, they were selected out sometimes, because they're trying to show a film. And it hit the headlines because they were successful. They persevered, the branch persevered, and they showed it last week. And it hit the BBC, national news, international news. So showing a film in a university is now national news on the BBC, if you want to know how bad it is. But also, once you've been defending the victim, the second point, again, it gives you the moral high ground. Right? Nobody can question you if you're defending the victims. If you're defending the voiceless and people who can't speak up. And calling upon the state to act is always dangerous. Eric Hines, in a book which I recommend called Hate Speech and Democratic Citizenship, points out that almost all nations, except for the US, of course, have penalties for some form of a speech that's said to be hateful. So whether it's for the protection of the security of the state or individuals, he points out it's always an attack on democracy. In the end, calling something hateful means we're not going to allow you to speak. We're not going to allow everybody to have the right to speak. And Nadine Strossen, who's a great fighter for free speech in the United States, always says that you deal with hate not by censorship, but by arguing for free speech, because the concept of hate and protecting people from hate always turns back on the groups that you're trying to oppress. So she goes through, you're trying to defend oppressed groups and it ends being turned upon them. So Jewish groups in America and many others around the world. So the weaponizing of hate is really interesting because it's not like the old left or the unions think. Hate now means that you want to stop the speech, not that challenges people in power, that reinforces the speech of people in power. So the speech you now define as hate speech is that challenges the state, what's in power. So we need to have a challenge to it, and this is my challenge to you. There's a very simple way of challenging free speech, and it's from Chief Justice Louis Brandeis in the American Supreme Court. It's Whitney versus California. If you want to know, Charlotte Whitney was a communist propagating the subversion of the state, and she was found guilty, as it happens. But Brandeis gave a great speech on free speech, and he made the point that the way to deal with speech you hate, for whatever reason, is more speech. Right? You deal with speech by more speech. So however much you detest the speech, you must have more speech. And we, bigots, are now being tested. Right? When hateful speech is heard weekly on our streets, we have to hold on to our principles and not turn to censorship. This does not mean that we say that's their free speech and that's okay. A commitment to free speech means that we have to criticise, challenge and denounce speech we find to be wrong, immoral or nasty. So what is under threat at the moment is our commitment to more and more speech. So bigots, don't weaken.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I'm glad you mentioned the weaponization thing, because that's one of the things that I thought we should discuss. Let's move on. Ike.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. As I was getting ready for my speech this morning, getting ready to catch the train and thinking about what I'd say, I had the misfortune to listen to a radio interview. And on this radio interview, it's by a famous national radio host. I probably won't mention him, depends how well this goes down. But he and the interviewer described the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, as disgusting, sewage, and malign. Now, look, you can have your opinions about Suella Braverman, about the Tories, Labour, whatever, but I don't think that contributes anything to public debate, and it doesn't do anything to diminish the role hate plays in our society. And you often find it's the people who purport to be the most aggressively against hate who use it for their own means and ends, so, which is sadly the situation in which we're now in. And why did they call her these things? They didn't call it to describe her like that because she was a rapist or a murderer or a paedophile. She was described in that way simply because she had different political opinions to their own. And it's a very dangerous point we're at now, where we've allowed morality and politics to coalesce and intervene with each other to the extent that whereby if you disagree with somebody politically, you can't just be wrong, you're now evil. There's a moral judgment on political thought, and I think that's a really dangerous place to be in. I cannot imagine Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee in the middle of the 20th century vehemently disagreed about many things, nationalism, Britain's role in the world. I cannot imagine them calling each other scum and sewage because they disagreed politically. But for whatever reason, that's where we are now. Right, so how have we got here? I think hate laws, sadly, have played a big part in this. The problem with hate laws is, essentially, it treats the same crime as different depending on the assumed emotional motivation of the aggressor. And basically, I don't think laws or the police or parliament should care about what's in my mind. They should only care about what I do. Me as a person, I don't really care what people think. Think whatever you like, I don't really care. I care moderately about what they say, but I care most about what they do. And I think that's what the police and the laws should also be in the position of enforcing as well. The whole idea of trying to police what we think or what we're motivated by is extremely dangerous, because it ultimately comes down to subjective opinion and not objective rule of law. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're in the place we are in at the moment. And it always strikes me as ironic. You've essentially got, we've seen it with the reaction to October 7th, you've got a form of moral collapse or moral lack of confidence in the West at the moment, not just in here, but in many countries. But hate speech is almost saying that we must be guided by a kind of puritanical moral rigor internally in our minds, but it's fine if externally in society everything is fallen apart. So it's an unrealistic ideal and ambition to impose, and it's a violation, I think, of the power of the individual to think essentially whatever they like, but only be censured by the law when they actively do something, not think something, do something that harms or demeans me or anybody else. Now, it's impossible to talk about this without mentioning about the context of the marches that have been taking place over the tragic events in Israel and Gaza as well, taking place in London, my own city today, as we speak. And there's been all kinds of debates about whether the marches are valid or not. Suella Braverman called them hate speeches. Some have said they've been kind of allowed racial hatred to bloom in a way that hasn't happened, we've not really seen on British streets for a long time. Would I have called them hate speeches? Probably not. I understand and I accept, I acknowledge there is a huge amount of racial hatred at some of those marches. I don't think everybody there is driven by that, but it has happened, it has been there, but it still doesn't kind of, it's a catch-all phrase that doesn't reflect all the motivations that might be there. Should they have been banned? Look, look, one thing to point out, which no one really did, the police ban marches all the time in London. There's constantly ban marches. So they do have it within their legal armory to do this if they wanted to. They chose not to. As someone who believes in free speech and democracy, I'm instinctively inclined to not like banning things. Banning a hate march is almost like, if you've got a leaky roof, you put the bowl there so it collects the water. It's very good, it's fine. It stops the carpet getting wet, but it doesn't really resolve the problem of the leaky roof. And that's the problem with banning hate marches. The hate is still there. It just has to find other more insidious ways of expressing itself. So, but basically they are, in many ways, they sum up the problems and the kind of tensions and issues we have in our culture at the moment, whereby what is the dividing line between being actively or politically opposed to a certain action that's happening, but when does that cross over into hatred and bigotry and vitriol against a particular group or people? It's a very difficult balance to have. It's a fine line to have. I'm not saying it's easy to set where that line should be, but I don't think we've done that at the moment, and that I think is potentially a problem. But just to conclude, one of the things that's kind of annoyed me most about the marches is that they've exposed the hypocritical attitude of many people, often on the left, not entirely, but many people who for years and years and years have lectured us, have told all of us that hate is wrong and that activism for Black Lives Matter or for Me Too or activism against Islamophobia has been in place to combat hate and to stop hate rising and to stop hate becoming a part of our society. Fine. That's what they've been saying. But then, if that's the case, it's these same people who said BLM was conceived to stop racial hatred who can't be unequivocal in their condemnation of the racial hatred we saw in Israel on October 7th. It's the same people who said Me Too was required to liberate women who can't be unequivocal about in their condemnation of the fact that Jewish women were raped on October the 7th. It's the same people who condemn Islamophobia, who can't unequivocally condemn the religious persecution that took place on October 7th. And just to conclude, it's also the same people who say silence is violence who have been silent about unequivocally condemning the appalling acts we saw on October 7th. So just to conclude, I don't think hate is a huge problem, it's a terrible problem, but I think the problem with hate is not that it's corrosive. The problem with hate at the moment in our society is that too many people think it's convenient.
Okay, thank you. And it's good that you raised the question of boundaries, and as opposed to Dennis maybe claiming a more open, more speech. And,
my role here.
Question that we need to consider. Liz.
I'll just challenge you on Churchill. What would have happened to him today when he said to a woman, "Madam, tomorrow I will be sober, but you will still be ugly."
He did say that, that's true. That's true.
A
momentary lapse.
No. I'm feeling like I've got imposter syndrome now because I'm with all these learned people who do this all the time. And here's me. It's a free speech event, so I'm just going to speak freely. For 35 years, I was on the radio and hardly ever had a script. So I just came along today because I am passionate about this subject. So ask me whatever you like. But I'm reminded of the importance of free speech more in the last 2 days than ever. I'm from Irish stock, so what's happened in Dublin is perhaps understandably closer to my heart than many of the other horrible situations going on currently. But I've been going there since I was 2 years old, and I was just absolutely aghast the other day, but not surprised. I went to Dublin 5 years ago and decided I didn't really want to go there again because I thought it's lost its particular Irish character and its charm. And I've been hearing from my Irish friends so many horror stories which don't get reported. I mean, talk about free speech, but there's total censorship, as far as I'm concerned, by most of the media on what's been happening across Ireland. Two guys beheaded for being homosexual. This week, before the kids were stabbed, a woman walking up Grafton Street, 60-year-old woman, just randomly stabbed. In May, a young man at the top of Grafton Street, just randomly stabbed. Incidents all over Ireland. Anyway, to this week's incidents, and it's just funny if it wasn't so distressing. Immediately this happens, there's a watershed, and on one side you get the people who are rightfully and naturally appalled that small innocent kids and their teacher carer will be attacked in broad daylight in a European capital city. And then, without much provocation, you get everybody wading in and starting defending immigrants in Ireland before anybody's really attacked them. It wasn't known who the attacker was. It wasn't reported for almost 24 hours. And it wasn't, so we couldn't know we knew he was male. We couldn't know his motives. We couldn't know his background. The Irish head of the Irish Garda immediately came out and said, this is not a terror-related event, like an hour after it. He didn't know that. And all the mainstream media piled in and told the party line. And that kind of provoked this divide then. So it became not a discussion about the attempted murder of children, which we now know it was. It became a virtue signalling exercise in, I'm a nicer person than you, because I care about these poor people who've moved to Ireland from Algeria, where it was rumoured he was from. I don't care if he's from Algeria, Austria, or Australia, if he's stabbing people on the streets of a city I love. But anyway, it became this divide. And I held back on, posting on social media about this because I didn't know the facts. I have to say, I think in our discussion, I would like to make the point that I think the likes of Twitter has been very democratising. It's given people who never had a voice. You don't have to be like me and gobshite on the radio or telly or writing a paper now to have an opinion. You can express your opinion. It's also very dangerous. But as soon as I got the facts from Ireland on what had happened and who they call it the suspect, he's lying on the floor with his mouth bashed in, pinned down by 2 women. But as soon as the suspect was identified, not by name, but in other ways, and his whereabouts and the facts of the incident, and I posted about it, whoosh. And it's been going on for years now, since 8 years ago when I started reviewing the papers on Sky, and Alistair Campbell set up this Twitter hashtag, FBPE. FBPE. Every abusive, I'm serious, every abusive Twitter message that you get has that hashtag. And it's personal and it's bigoted, but they call you a bigot if you don't follow their so-called caring, sharing, liberal agenda. And what they're doing on Twitter today is they are minimising what's happened to children and their teacher, and they are using this as a platform to talk about Brexit and to open up the debate again about Schengen and free movement of people. And I just find them narrow-minded and ignorant, and they're certainly not the left wing that my family were, who came over. My great-grandma was a member of Sinn Féin, but who came over, who joined trade unions, who worked in the mills, who were in the Labour Party, the trades and labour movement, who believed in education, who worked in the mill and then got books and educated themselves. And then my parents were the first to go to university. They're not that kind of left-wing person. So it just opens your eyes. So I'll wrap now. Sorry, I didn't have a script, but I've gone on too long.
No, that's fine. That's fine. There's lots of stuff that we can come back to in there. Finally, Andy.
Thank you. My favourite satirical artist, Miriam Ellia. Hands up, anyone who's heard of Miriam Ellia? Great. Well, look her up if you don't know her. But she wrote the Ladybird spoof books, which you might have seen. And then Ladybird sued her, closed them down, nicked the idea, and then she republished created her own publishing company called Dung Beetle Books, and produces far more cutting satire. So go and check her out. But she's recently produced one which is sort of based on Learn with Mother, those old 1960s books. And there's a brilliant cartoon in it, and the child is looking up and going, Mummy, what is hate speech? And she looks down, it's anything we don't like, dear. That was a lovely little summary. But calling people a bigot is actually very effective. And I think one of the things we should really take away is a discussion I had when trying to book a large London venue for a book launch with Graham Linehan for his new book, and we couldn't find a single venue in London that would take him on. There was one particular venue owner who was very sympathetic but just said, look, Andy, I just can't do it, I can't do it. So I said, well, would you meet me for dinner and let's just sit down and look at practical ways of how you could do it, because it would be great if your venue was a sort of free speech venue in London. And we talked about how the staff who didn't want to work, we could get them to work, we could take it different insurance, we could get our own PR team and all the rest of it. And he said, but we do actually have a problem, and we theoretically solved a number of the problems. But he does have a genuine problem where people will ring up and say, well, you're putting this particular event on. Antifa was actually this particular organisation. And it's not us, but we know there's a bunch of lads coming down from Yorkshire who will come down with baseball bats, and you're going to take that one on. So he had to pull the event. And that's the sort of level of intimidation that people are really facing. So I think there's one thing we should be really, really clear about. One is the activists are not trying to win us over. They're not trying to win the argument. They're not trying to win our hearts and minds. They're not trying to convince us of the rightness of their argument, their logic or their moral philosophy. They're using two mechanisms. One is bureaucratic. So it is about guidelines, it is about HR policy, it is about influencing the law. It is about influencing institutions to impose a particular outlook and a particular level of conformity, and matched with intimidation. And sometimes that is public intimidation to isolate and humiliate individuals, and intimidation against institutions. So against venue owners, TV commissioners, etc., etc. And of course, most people just wanted a quiet life, actually. You know, yes, I'd love to put this person on, but I don't want to spend 2 weeks trying to deal with all the problems and the PR and then the trustees and the board of directors and everybody complaining about what a reputational damage has been caused to the institution, etc. So they don't want to win us over. It is bureaucratic and it is intimidation. They're the two key techniques. So we should really recognize that. And it has two effects. One is it creates a real sort of conformity of culture. Secondly, it ruins individuals' careers and destroys people's careers. And it puts younger people off from taking risks, from trying things out, from writing that play, from writing the sketch show, from doing the performance. It just creates a real culture of conformity. So we don't really know what we're missing because it's not being created. I mean, there are no sitcoms on television nowadays. I mean, why have we got no sitcoms that look at stereotypical characters, the funny things of everyday life, that we can explore them and have a collective experience and enjoyment about, with those things. So we, as some of you know, just by the way, just as a sort of poll here, slightly self-indulgent, how many, hands up if you've heard of or been to Comedy Unleashed?
Ooh.
Yes, the marketing works. Well, that's great. So you'll probably all know, we set the club up about 5.5 years ago, Andrew Doyle and I, actually indirectly in response to the response to Brexit. Because the big bigots there were the Brexit voters, the stupid gammon, the poorly educated northern folk who voted for Brexit. And we basically were sick of it and thought, right, sod this. The first ever gig before we called it Comedy Unleashed, actually we tried to find as many comedians as we could in the UK who actually were pro-Brexit, or at least not against it, and we found 4 people. That's how I first met Andrew. But, we set it up to sort of challenge groupthink, try and create a space where people could be creative, and also to defend comedians who were cancelled, so people whose careers were taken down. We would actively defend them. Sometimes it was literally paying people's mortgages. You forget that when people lose a career, they really, can't afford to, feed the kids and all the rest of it. Andrew Lawrence, Count Dankula, Chris McGlade, there's a whole bunch of people that, we've worked with over time. But what's interesting is the nature of the bigotry has changed. It was Brexit voting, gammon, stupid people. And then it was racist. Racist is quite a common one. I know lots of comedians have been accused of being racist, and I'll give you another example in a moment. And then it's all the TERFs. It's all the sort of transphobic stuff. And Graham, we've been working with Graham for about a year now, because he has been shut out of his own industry. I don't know if people know, but he wrote Father Ted the Musical, which would be a massive success. And we could not find, and we got some fairly senior level. Okay. We couldn't find a single West End theatre to take it on. Anyway, just moving on then, final minute. There's one thing, and I think it's a question really for the audience, is I think the 7th of October has also changed things in quite a dangerous way. And I'll give you an example. At the club 2 weeks ago, one of the comedians made a joke about the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. And just in case. And it was a very funny joke, which I'm not going to repeat here. And thank God there's not a video of it. And she walked out. Now, and she said to me, it's a racist joke. I said, what did he say? She told me. I said, sounded quite good to me. But she did come back in, well done, and she said she's going to come to the next gig. And thank God that is the case, because a couple of days later, outside the club, 400 people marched for Palestine to the local Labour MP's office to complain, basically to harangue her for not voting on the ceasefire in the right way. Palestinian flags are currently all along the street. And what if it had been more like the Wakefield school, where the mother was dragged into the mosque, flanked by the local councillor and the police chief to publicly apologise, or Batley Grammar School, where the RE teacher is still in hiding. 2.5 years, he is still in hiding. Or Salman Rushdie, who lost an eye. And it was the first time I thought, oh my God, this could turn really nasty. So I don't know the answer to it. I think, generally speaking, we've got to create spaces for people to be creative. We've got to defend and support people who take risks and try stuff out. And we've got to try and create a scene that is attractive, particularly to younger people, that it is cool and fun for banter, to be tasteless, satire, and all the rest of it. But it's a question as to how do we deal with this potentially quite dangerous turn of events.
Okay. Okay, so it's over to you.
Thank you to all the panel. I'd like to ask about how we expand the basis of support for free speech. I was first involved in the free speech movement 40 years ago when I went to university and joined a pro-life group. And we had socialist workers and some feminist groups not trying to debate, but trying to shut us down and to avoid debate. 30 years later, many of those same people were targeted themselves through the trans movement and became quite strong advocates for free speech, and good alliances have come, not necessarily agreeing on the issue, but in terms of defending free speech. On 7th of October, some people on the left perhaps have had their eyes open about, with the protests since, and have become more open to free speech. But it's easy, once you're attacked, it's easy to become a free speech advocate. How do we expand the basis on people who aren't currently attacked, but might be in the future?
Yeah, I feel like we're living in Pwk Times. The only reason we have any semblance of free speech right now is because it took a billionaire $44 billion to buy Twitter to give us peasants some semblance of free speech. If he hadn't done that, we'd have the little bit that we have now. We wouldn't even have that. They would keep our mouths shut. And you can see what's happened in the Netherlands, what's happened in Argentina. You see it with the Trump coming back, who may be president again. I was at the Academy of Ideas Festival in London a little while back. They had a Trump thing, and you had intellectuals up here, oh, Trump is this and Trump is that. And I'm thinking, you people have no idea what us regular people really feel, and you couldn't care less. Even people that I say are on our side still don't get it. But I think we're going to find out, and I hope it's sooner than later in this great country. Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on what Liz was saying, actually, because I'm very concerned with how the focus on speech is there so strongly, and the focus on action, really hateful action, such as that stabbing, it just seems to have swapped around completely. And I was really shocked about the response to October the 7th. The people saying things were understandable, people talking about absolute horrific acts in this very bland way, and unable to seemingly summon up their sense of judgment. And I think that it's such a corrosive effect on society, because we do think about words so much and minimise real evil actions when they happen.
I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't care what people say. As far as I'm concerned, say it, apart from being called a peasant by my friend there. But that's a different story. Yeah, thank you. Cheers, bro. Thanks. I think to answer, was it David's question about how do we protect free speech or something along those lines, I think we've all got to be braver. It's as simple as that. Because if we keep quiet and keep things to ourselves that we think we should be saying, whether opinions or not, I'm not saying ridiculous opinions, obviously, but if you're brave enough to say it, it will breed a culture of everybody else being able to say things as well. And I think looking round the room, as it's been noticed before, the certain age demographic in the room, we've got to be the example for younger people to keep free speech alive, otherwise we will lose it.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I'd be interested in just how far all these boundaries are pushed, and if anybody in the room actually sees a problem in any of this speech. Because, you know, we live in a society where there's some fairly putrid things being said just now. So how far do you actually go? I mean, is this just, like Dennis said, you know, you need more speech to combat bad speech, or is there any boundaries? So I don't know if anybody's got any opinions on that, but if you have, then it would be good to hear from you. Yes, at the back.
It's just sort of exploring that a little bit, because it's about the idea of polemic. And polemic is basically a really strong criticism against your opponent. And I understand the tradition where polemic has come from. But at the moment, when we don't have a very strong political culture, and you have something like the events in Israel that happened, some people who've been following the events have been quite clear and strong in their criticism, for example, around the demonstrations. But a number of people who are a bit left behind in some of the discussions probably feel, whoa, where did that come from? And I'm just wondering how you bridge that, because I know that even amongst my friends, and we're relatively political, we don't necessarily have the same environment where we're discussing on a day-to-day basis some of these things. So what you then have is everything's in your head. You don't necessarily have the opportunities to debate these things. And what you then have in the news is polar opposite discussions. And it's very hard to take people with you, work out your own process of thinking. And I'm just wondering, that is a bit of a practical problem. And I think that's where social media is not a problem. It's the fact that you then have these unmediated sort of positions. And they're not really very effective polemic. They're more just like tribal camps as you experience them. So I think we do have a bit of a practical problem, which is about the unpolitical times that we live in, and how do we bridge that clarity, but taking people with you on that journey, and that's a tension.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about what happened in Dublin that was probably most shocking is that you have, you know, 2 schoolgirls and some other people stabbed. You know, an incredible event. And Dublin is a small town. Within 2 hours, everybody, you know, along the N81 knows exactly what's happened, who the person, you know, what the person looked like, all the rest of it. But the Irish political and media elite decide that the thing to get most outraged over is the imagined outrage about anti-immigrant sentiment. And it has been the most incredible, I mean, talk about disinformation, the way in which it has been reported, particularly by British media, has just been as if they know nothing of what happened. And the problem I have is I disagree with someone who just spoke just there saying, I don't care what people say. I really care what people say. And I really care when people say things that I disagree with and I don't like. And I think that that what's happening in Ireland is that all these, you know, Varadkar or anyone else thinks they can say there's no anti-immigrant sentiment till the cows come home. But there is. There actually is a problem with anti-immigrant sentiment in Ireland. There's a problem with it here. It's not the kind of far-right march that, I don't know, people in The Guardian might imagine is there. But there is, as Alistair says, there's some quite nasty views out there, particularly around immigration, that I want to hear what people have to say and I want to argue with them. So I think that, you know, as Dennis sort of outlined with his more speech position, we get into, I think, dangerous territory if we just say that our position on free speech absolutism, which I'm also a free speech absolutist, means anything goes, and means, it's just, let's just throw anything out in the air. I think we don't need police to police hate speech, the authorities, but we need to not police each other, but part of free speech means that we're accountable to each other, and that you don't just let things fly, and that if you're find yourself if you do that kind of thing, on a pro-Palestine march and there's someone with a Hamas banner next to you, that you thump them, or that you intervene. You know, you do something. That if you're on a Brexit march and there's someone with a hairy poster, that you have an interaction. I think we need to care what people say. We need to care about speech, and it's not just a free-for-all. And if we're going to win the arguments beyond an open debate argument and actually fight for our ideas, we have to take some social responsibility ourselves.
Okay, so panel, pick up on what you want to really. I'm going to start with you, Dennis. I am actually going to throw, though, the question as to why is it that we act so strongly on speech now, but not on the physical things that might harm us? How is it that your understanding that speech has come so far to the fore?
Well, because we've conflated speech and action, so we don't see the difference. And I think speech is taken as action. But I was invited to talk at this event called the Disinformation Summit in Cambridge. I was doing the free speech debate with Gavin Titley, who's in America. I should do it online. And I started to research what disinformation meant, because I'd never really heard about it. And there's masses of money in trying to stop people being stupid. So there's lots of money in Oxford, and it's a very posh event. And I went through their papers, and one was, we've still got to settle terms with Brexit, how stupid people were at Brexit. So they've got psychological programs, all sorts of others, to stop people dealing with being stupid. But you also have to watch what you're saying. I always get this, people use vituperative speech. John Stuart Mill said, you shouldn't use it if you can avoid it, but, it's usually the people in power who use vituperative speech, insult personality and whatever. And the idea that because it's polemic, as Joe says, people are not stupid. One of the things that I read on the disinformation and studies is if people can sift through it. So no matter how much bad information they get, they can work it out. They can talk about it, they can work it out themselves. People are not stupid. And it's wrong to say that there's too much polemic, there's too much vitriol, because people aren't stupid, they can deal with it. I think, and you've got to have great faith in people. But on how you build it, it's not just speaking up, I think you have to be persistent. The reason free speech is now back in the headline, you have to say, is because of the gender-critical feminists. Right? They have done a really good job in bringing free speech to everybody's minds. I think Spike did it with free speech rankings for universities. But the thing is, when that issue changes, will the same group of people defend other people's free speech? That's the thing, because free speech means defending the free speech of people you dislike. Otherwise, you don't believe in free speech. So you have to be consistent, and you have to persist at it, even though it's a difficult thing. But as Ella said, you don't just accept it. It doesn't mean you just go with all the lies and rubbish that they put forward.
Okay. Liz, anything that you want to pick up on out of that batch of questions?
Yeah, this gentleman here, how do we defend our right to assert our ideas and free speech? I think it's something I've been desperately clutching at now since the Brexit referendum, and all the pollsters were predicting the result. And I said, no, Brexit's going to triumph. No, all the polls don't say that. I said, yeah, but people are too frightened to say, even to a polling organisation, what their innermost thoughts are. Look, and when people put the tick in a box, a cross in a box, in the privacy of a booth, anonymously, that's when their true feelings come out. And it proved right on that occasion. And I think we have to defend that to the hilt. People are saying now, there are big statements made in the media, this is how people think, the majority think like that, and then we get another election or whatever, and the result comes out differently because people are too frightened to express their opinions. What we've got to, we've got to protect stringently is our right to go into an this sounds Luddite, go into an electronically connected box with a pencil and a piece of paper and put our cross down there and then put it anonymously in a box. Then you'll get rid of all Trump's right or wrong claims that things are rigged, it can't, that is a fundamental right that we've got to be able to continue to do all over the world. And look at what happened in Holland this week. Holland, I love it. You think it's one of the coolest, funkiest places. But it's quite so liberal. And yet the people I know there have been desperately fed up for a long time now and this guy triumphs. So whether you like him or not, that reflects what people are upset about and thinking. So it's got to be down to the ballot box. And just quickly, that lady who spoke there and asked about, sorry.
Go well quickly then. 'Cause I just
Okay.
want to
The lady there was talking about who'd you talk to. I find it's a narrower and narrower group of people that I can have a really honest chat with, and not impose my views on, but you can just sit there and say, what do you think about Israel and Palestine? This is what I think. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I barking up the wrong tree? I think it's all obscene. There are very few people that I can have that kind of conversation with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting that there's a certain sort of bottling up of what people think that then comes out in a space where, like Holland perhaps, or like actually over the Israel-Palestine situation, where there is an argument to be made that it's better out there, and at least we can understand what it is that we need to tackle. But Ike, anything that you want to pick up on out of that?
Well, I think the idea of boundaries is really interesting. And look, I believe in free speech. It's a function of democracy, so I'm completely committed to it. But we've got to be realistic. There are boundaries as to what we can say. And the natural boundary, if you like, is the law. And that's why the law is so important. And the way in which police interpret the law is so important as well. Now, we've seen, talking about the marches again, in London, the Metropolitan Police, who have not covered themselves in glory with the way those marches have been handled, but we saw their interpretation of the word jihad. Now, I know jihad can mean a personal emotional struggle, I get that, but people shouting it at the top of their voices at Whitehall are not talking about an emotional journey. But it gives you an idea of the way in which certain people, the authorities or the state, are able to manipulate their interpretation of law or free speech into whatever kind of medium they like. And that is dangerous. But it's not dangerous enough for me to believe that there shouldn't be a boundary. I believe in free speech, but there are certain things that we shouldn't say. You're not supposed to incite racial hatred, for instance. I believe in that. So I don't see that as censorship. I see that as a kind of responsible way, responsible line in which we can not police free speech, but balance the need for freedom and...
But just to push you on that a little
goodness,
bit,
if
then,
you like.
because a lot of the things that the police wanted to intervene on the march today were on the signs that they said were expressing racial hatred.
Yeah.
So, in your view, should they have, through these hate speech laws and the legislation that is in place around it now, had the right to intervene and to arrest people with those signs? Is that legitimate?
I think it's very simple. You either implement the law or you don't. It's literally that simple. I get the operational reasons why the police are reluctant. It's far easier to police 30 people than it is to police 100,000 people. That's obvious. But if the police are seen to be cherry-picking the law, then what do they expect everybody else to do? So if you have these things, if you say these, you enforce it. And it's not good enough if they just say, oh, we'll let this slide.
But you'd accept that that's a legitimate intervention, because they're going to go away and use facial recognition technology.
I think it'd be legitimate, yeah. If it's illegal, it's legitimate intervention. Okay. Now, what we can all debate about is whether it should be illegal. And I get Emma's point earlier that actually, look, I know, notwithstanding what I said about I don't care what people think, I'm moderately interested in what they say, but I'm mostly interested in what they do. I get how within us, I suppose, as a free speech debate, it's good if we're allowed to say whatever we like to each other. But I think we have to accept that the price for that is civil discourse. And I think civil discourse has collapsed in our culture, sadly. People are too hostile and too aggressive to each other, so it's a balancing act.
Okay, Andy, your thought?
I could... Sorry.
You can argue.
Maybe I should extend this debate, but actually something else I wanted to say. So we can come back to that. I think Joe made I was just asking a question earlier on about, and it's also cropped up from various people about how it's almost like our circles where we can have honest discussions have just got smaller and smaller, and it feels like the sort of space is closing in. And in fact, each new issue seems to challenge that more and more. And there's always a new issue. There's always the current thing has been coined. I think one of the things we need to do as much as we can is spend time with other people. So just a very simple example. There's one of our comedians, a guy called Nicholas DeSantos, who's just I think, fantastic. Totally unknown. His videos have done over 1 million views on our YouTube channel. And I think he's really, really clever. And he produces new material all the time. We booked him the other day, 10 minutes before he went on, and he just did some new material. Now, the comments underneath are really, really positive on all the YouTube stuff. I mean, some of them aren't, but most of them are. And he's got, 98% likes and all the rest of it. And all that's wonderful, and it's great for him. But there's nothing like being in a club packed with 300 people where the acts are, and it was like it a couple of weeks ago, where Andrew Doyle got drunk nearly a bottle of wine. One of the comedians made the joke that I just described. Just everyone was on form. And the audience was really mixed in every sense. And it was an absolute buzz.
Right,
and I
the promotion for your club has got to stop.
No.
Exactly.
No, sorry, all right, it's my lived experience.
Tickets on sale.
But I think, okay, I'll explain.
One
of the problems we've got is there isn't a collective work experience like we used to have. People used to work in factories, they used to work together, job for life and all that stuff. Communities, all of that. People knew each other. People had real embedded relationships with each other. Solidarity meant something because you knew each other. You looked after your mates. That has become atomized. And I think one of the things we have to do is find spaces and in our own personal lives, whether it's setting up, pub discussion groups or clubs or theatre groups or whatever, where we spend time with each other. Because I think that trust and honest discussion comes from real life experience with each other.
Ike, I thought the way you distinguished thoughts, speech, and action was very good to begin with, but I don't think your more recent comments hold up. Notion of a hate crime, that's a bad law. We should challenge it. We should defy it.
No, I agree. I agree.
Anything that defines, your crime according to what your supposed motivation was, and whether it was hateful rather than what you did, is a problem. We can't just defer to the law as an answer to that problem. I don't think we've quite answered Andy's points about intimidation and how to deal with intimidation. And in thinking about what happened on 7th of October, I wonder if it's helpful to also think about what happened to Charlie Hebdo. Because that was a very interesting episode. What happened in the wake of it was welcome, the Je suis Charlie thing. There were problems, because the French version of sort of state-backed laïcité meant that some people who were then said the wrong thing were clamped down on legally and weren't defended. So there were inconsistencies immediately after Charlie Hebdo, where people didn't, walk the walk and talk, as well as talk the talk on free speech. Nonetheless, Charlie Hebdo was a really gutsy publication, and we're not seeing anything like that now. And I think it's worth casting our mind back and trying to be a bit more je suis toujours Charlie, but not in the French intolerant laïcité, veil banning mentality, with a more tolerant mentality, but nonetheless uncompromising on free speech.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Hands up anybody who's been told they were a bigot to their face. Oh,
yeah. You all have.
Yes, lots of you. And I had it. Yeah, it happened to me yesterday. And bearing in mind what Ella Whelan said about anti-immigrant sentiment, I'll try to summarise this story as quickly as I can. There's a man who begs on our street in our shopping centre and has been there for years doing it. Currently he's selling the Big Issue. A woman yesterday bought a Big Issue from him, and I went up to her and said, "Do you think it's okay for someone to come from a foreign country and beg on our street?" She said, "Yes, he might have had a horrible life." I said, "But why should he bring that horrible life to us?" She said, "Well, because the British have done such awful things around the world." And then what happened was, I said, "Well, how many of these injured Slovenians, mentally injured Slovenians, should be able to come here?" She said, "Well, everybody." I said, "Well, I met a woman who was keen on defending abused women, and I discussed this similar subject with her, and I asked her, how many abused women in the world, should we say there's 50 million in the whole world, should be allowed to come to Britain?" She said, "Everybody." At this point,
Are you going to get to the point?
The lady in question, yes, I'm getting to the point now. The
quickly.
lady in question said, "I have no time to talk to a bigot and a racist. In any case, I feel ill," and flounced off. So am I a bigot? Tell me if I am.
This is not an anecdote, but if you do cast your mind back, it was the case that the real world was reflected on the internet. So you had icons which reflected physical items. You went on a safari, down the road, etc. Now that metaphor is actually being reversed because people spend more time looking at screens. So the hate speech, the origin of that is sort of community agreement. Now, if I have a forum, then it's fine to have an etiquette. And I say, you know, you don't spread hate on my forum. But to extend that to the entire world and say that hate speech has to be basically stamped out means that you have a new category of a thing which is extended from the internet. So how do I define that? Well, it's not a bug that it's defined ambiguously. It's a feature. Because on my forum, if I want to impose my etiquette, all I have to do is ambiguously specify that. So hate is hate, to go back to your definition. And then, therefore, I can use the techniques of, say, Herbert Marcuse, repressive toleration, to repress speech which I don't want and promote that which I do. And that's exactly what Twitter still does, actually, even though it's owned by Twitter X, is still owned, it's owned by Elon Musk. They still are using Herbert Marcuse's repressive toleration, and that is being extended into the real world through the legislation in Ireland too.
I just worry that all the discussion is about individuals cancelling people, but I think, as Andy hinted at, a lot of the pressure actually comes from organisations, from like charities organising Twitter pylons, from employers. I know one of the HR departments at one of the big financial services organisations, they just spend hours moderating the intranet. That's all they do, you know, because they're policing internal speech. And it's a lot harder to be brave in those kind of situations than in individual situations. And I agree with Andy, we need a collective response, but I just don't see how that happens. I know we've got organisations like the Free Speech Union and AFAF, and they're great, but they're supporting individuals. They're not creating a collective response. And, you know, it's a great idea spending time together, but when everyone's working from home, we just don't spend time together. And I just want to know how we can create something that is more collective.
I kind of agree with Sandy, who's sitting next to me, when he says the hate crime legislation is bad law and therefore we should oppose it. But I'm also very sympathetic with you because I spend a lot of time in China, and China is a rule-bound, law-bound society. And the way people get by is they break the rules all the time. And so the application of the law is entirely arbitrary and depends on your relationship to the party and lots of other different things. And it breeds an intense cynicism. So I kind of think we need a perpetual war against the laws that are wrong, but actually we almost need to be upholding the law as it stands, because we don't want to degenerate into a society where the application of the law is entirely arbitrary.
It's just interesting to me that the first time I think the word courage was mentioned was only just now, because to me it seems that courage is the absolutely central thing, and the response to so much of the stuff we don't like reeks of cowardice. People would far rather, for example, remain anonymous online because they're afraid of the consequences. They won't speak out even if it might make your life uncomfortable at work because they're afraid of the consequences. And fundamentally, people cheering on the Met Police going through footage of the march to come back and subsequently arrest them, speak because they're too afraid. They're afraid because they weren't prepared to go out on the same march and have it out with those people who have horrible views. And so fundamentally, there's nothing other than to try and recover some courage.
Okay, thanks. So Andy, starting with you, just give us a quick thought on one thing.
There's a really good comedy club.
Jeez.
On the first Friday of the month in Leeds, and the second Tuesday. Sorry, I have nothing else to say. Sorry, you...
Yes.
Sorry, is this our summation?
No!
Yeah, courage. Next.
Ike, this is not the final round.
Right,
We're
okay,
going
fair
out
enough.
for more questions, but just give us a response to one thing.
Just
now.
briefly on the hate crime issue. Look, I do agree hate crime laws have been some of the most ridiculous that have been signed in my lifetime. My point was that I don't think it's the role of the police to arbitrarily choose which laws they're going to implement and which laws they don't. And in terms of implementing laws, we have well-established, say, laws against racial hatred, which predate hate crime laws, which could be used to stop some of the things we've seen at those marches. And for whatever reason, they're not being used. So I'm not defending hate crime laws.
Okay. Liz, give us a thought on one of the things that was put forward.
I think it's a good point about community, because that's about accountability. And I read an article about online dating and why it's so horrible. And it's because you used to go out with your brother's friend. And I did, about 27 of them. And not on the same night. I never had to look for a boyfriend, and they never did anything wrong to our Elizabeth because they had my brother to answer to. And that's not like that now. We don't live in the same town across the road from our grandparents, and we don't date the boy from school. So it's the same generally. And it's not just gone from town to county to our nation. It's gone global. So you can say something, as I did a few years ago on Twitter, commenting on Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen. I got the most vile abuse, and it was obviously from bots that had been set up, and they combed the internet for stuff about me. It was vile, and I thought, that is very scary.
Okay, Dennis?
2 points. I tend to be sympathetic with the Shakespeare in Henry VI, where the rebels in the forest say they want social change. The first thing they do is kill all the lawyers. We get sued for that. But it makes an important point that social change comes from social action. So it's social action first, then the laws. So there was lots of social action, political action against racism that then led to the laws. The laws were very confused at the time. So I think there's that side to it. I was going to say it the first, and I didn't say it because I'm always saying it, that one of the ways of testing people's faith in free speech is to wait for the buts. So I believe in free speech, but right? I could have set it up, but I didn't know he was going to do it. So, if you ask yourself, have you got any buts? Because that deletes your belief in free speech. Simply as that. So that's a way you can ask yourself. Just wait for the but and then say, oh, well, you don't really believe in free speech.
Okay, I am going back to Andy to get his 30 seconds in, but can I just see the hands as Andy's speaking, where I'm going to go next? Okay, so if you go there.
Can I?
Yes.
Okay, so just on the march and what should be banned and what the police should do. I do think the police should, without fear or favour, apply the law. But I think just one further point is I think it's really important that, being in London with 300,000 people marching past you, chanting a whole bunch of stuff, it's really, really important that the appeal we make splinters off genuine extremists from the Muslim accountants, pharmacists, people working in the call centre, mainstream, ordinary people who are emotionally moved by what's happening in Gaza. And I think that we should run that through before we have our response. I do think there's very, very clear, there's very, very clear hate speech incitement. And it's probably, some of it's happening in the mosques. It's not all happening on the streets. And there should be very clear action, but it should be extremely targeted. There should be a very, very, very clear-cut case that any reasonable person would understand, and then action is taken. I think there's a danger if you take a different approach that you're actually just seen to clamp down on people's speech. Okay. So I think very targeted and address, make sure it can run past sort of moderate opinion.
Yeah. Yes, this is very quick. I really agree that it does need to be social activism and groups, and lots of WhatsApp groups, basically. But we needed the Fustata ruling, because that's really helped a lot, especially with gender-critical feminism.
The one phrase I heard all day is people are afraid to speak up. And I think that's really unhelpful, because it absolves you from the responsibility to do something. There's something else out there which actually makes me afraid. What we should much more talk about, I think, is that people take responsibility and they should speak up. So the phrase is unhelpful, I think.
Yes, I would like to ask the question, am I a bigot? Because the London pro-Palestine march, I thought it was right that it should be allowed to go ahead and be kept away from the cenotaph. But I did not like that there were people praying along the march. And I just felt that shouldn't be happening. Does that make me a bigot? I mean, I honestly don't think I would have liked it if there had been Christians praying. I just feel it's bizarre. So it's not against free speech, but it is, I want to be able to say that, and yet I know that I have to be a bit careful about where and how I say it, but I do think it's an important thing.
Yeah, just a question that was raised at the meeting I was at earlier this week, which I've been thinking about. So on these anti-Israel marches, if you have people making chants that Jews find threatening, and I don't mean emotionally threatening, they feel emotionally uncomfortable, but they feel that it could, before very long, lead to a physical threat, how should we react to that as defenders of free speech?
It's remarkable that nobody has yet used the obscene C word, namely COVID. And I just wonder whether this is actually quite relevant to the normalisation of general hatred, given that we lived for 2 years in conditions in which the state was deliberately encouraging mass hatred towards people who perhaps didn't want to gimp up to go shopping, or didn't want to put a certain injectable into their bodies. Hate was normalised. And of course, we were, to your point, split up through lockdown and put online. So I wonder whether this is quite relevant to how we've ended up where we are.
Okay, thanks.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Quick poll. How many people feel that we need more courage to be more courageous against and to defend free speech? Okay, quick poll again. How many people would swap places with the battery teacher now?
No. Yeah, one of the things I'm really aggravated about is the level of conformity that's coming into art, and I really agree. I find it hard to disagree with mostly anything that's been said here so far, but one of the things I'm really disliking is sort of the mainstreaming of safe art, if you will. How can we get back to engendering, gutsy, risky art in the film industry, in books, whatever it might be, beyond just buying them or making them ourselves?
Assuming we're no more of a bigot than anyone else, or we're no less than a bigot than anyone else, surely we shouldn't spend more time complaining about other people than we do about ourselves. So do you think everyone here is being too cynical, and like there would be a benefit if we were more optimistic and thinking about like solutions?
I was at the Battle of Ideas in London 3 weekends ago, and as many people may know, it was held in Westminster. And on the Saturday night, it took me an hour to get from Westminster to Trafalgar Square, with hundreds of thousands of protesters there. Now, this wasn't a gentle protest. There were words, there were obviously singing from the river to sea and all that sort of thing, but when it came to death to Marks and Spencer's, death to McDonald's, then I felt a little intimidated. And the fact that it took me an hour to get up there was because I was behind a Korean rugby player who fought his way through there. And I was hanging onto his rucksack. 60 years ago, I would have been doing that. But it frightened me in a way, because there was a lot of intimidation, because there I was as an infidel struggling through the crowd. But what really hit me home was when I got back to Yorkshire the following weekend, there were buses arranged from Dewsbury and Batley to go down to the protest for the next weekend. And it just crossed my mind that, was this a practice to show the power of Islam?
It was just a point about fear and courage and so on. I think the fear that people have for speaking openly is very real. I see it a lot at work. I often speak out on things in the union and so on. I work for a university. People are afraid to say anything. They don't chime in, and then they approach me personally and say, "Oh, I'm glad you said that because I didn't dare say it." So yes, it requires courage, but I do understand that people genuinely are afraid. I think one thing, just to make one point, I think practice is everything. I think coming to things like this is good. Practice the arguments, because it gives you more courage if you practice the arguments. We've been doing politics in pubs in Newcastle, and now other people are doing that around the country. Again, it's practice. If you practice the arguments, you can actually win arguments.
Okay, thanks. So, panel. You've got about a minute each.
Okay.
So just give us something to take away.
Well, it's like the girl at the back said, you know, what can we do that's positive? I think there's two things. I think, you know, sometimes you have to have a fight, and people are taken down, or you're attacked, or there's, you know, this culture war, you know, it's a war on culture. So we have to fight to defend and advance the culture that we believe in. And that involves taking a stand. And we have to do that if we believe in it and if we believe in ourselves. I think also we've got to be creative, and we've got to create something new. And I'm not even funny, right? We set up a comedy club because I wanted to go and see good comedy. That's why we did it. So it just became something. It just struck a chord. And in fact, we could probably set one up in every town in the country if there were enough people to organise it. But there aren't. I haven't got, you know. So you can just go and do stuff. So I think whether you write or setting up discussion groups or meeting in the pub or theatre or whatever it is, we all need to create something and try and inspire the next generation to do exactly the same themselves.
Thanks, Andy. Liz. We can thank them all at the end.
I think it's hard to be brave. I mean, I used to have aspirations to be an MP, but I wouldn't want to do it now. Look what's happened to MPs recently over Israel and Gaza. They've had mobs outside their offices. They've had to call for police protection. Some of them have had to put screens up. It's, you know, you're putting your life in your hands. It is undermining our democracy. That's the first thing I'd like to say. Secondly, the arts. I mean, you introduced me as mad about music, and I am. And music is totally banal now and watered down and lacking in passion. It's not. I listened to a lot of stuff today. I thought it's just not emotive. It's not because I'm an old fogey. I'm not harking back to Elvis Presley like my mum and dad did. It's just got no passion. Where are the angry young people writing songs and playing guitars and thrashing it out? They don't do it. It's all sanitised. It's all Adele and Ed Sheeran. And that's not accidental. That's not accidental. You wouldn't even be allowed to have a band called the Sex Pistols anymore, never mind any of the album titles. I've got friends in bands who now go through the set lists, you know, songs that might have been big hits in the 70s, and they've got to take them out because they might offend. So, as you said, Andy, our culture is under attack. And just very quickly, I know it's a thing about big ideas, but it's a huge idea, and you might think I'm nuts and a conspiracy theorist, but I think all civilisations eventually implode. And I think ours is under attack, and it's under attack, and the method is divide and conquer. So we've now got left, supposedly, and right, and we're all slagging each other off, and there's all this hate, and Russia and China and everybody else, Saudi Arabia we've mentioned, everybody else who's got a laptop on their desk is getting involved. And they don't have to send an army in to wipe out Europe. They can just undermine us culturally, economically, in every way they can, digitally and through the thought police. So let's be conscious of that and try and get all these people who are jumping on bandwagons and are ill-informed to learn a little and be a little bit more understanding of what's really going on.
Okay, thanks, Liz.
Okay, just briefly to conclude, I think the question, I think Stephen's question over here about what can we do if we believe in free speech, but obviously acknowledge that Jews and certain people in London feel unsafe as a result of the marches. And it's a very difficult thing to square, because we obviously believe in the right to protest, but it is true. I've spoken to people who don't go into central London anymore on a Saturday because whether they're Jewish or not, they don't feel safe, or they feel intimidated. And that is a reality. And it's not a reality I like in a city I grew up in and I'm from, which has spent history, centuries, being a refuge and a sanctuary for people who have tried to escape persecution and hate. So it's a difficult balance to meet, but I think the solution is, as far as we can do, again, I've talked far too much about the police this afternoon, but it's ensuring that the police ensure that criminality does not take place, or at least it's minimized. And if people have had more confidence that that was the case, then I think it would potentially be less intimidating. And just finally, two really quick points. I think I'm conflicted about social media. I understand this gentleman's point about it gives all of us an opportunity to say something, to be publishers, to be editors, writers, etc. But we can't ignore the fact there is an immense amount of hate and abuse and vitriol on social media, and it's weaponized many people to say things they would never normally say or think in public, but they're happy to write it on social media. And I don't know what the solution is. And just finally, despite saying that, I do think most people are good people. We've been talking about hate and bigotry. I don't think most people are hateful or bigoted. Most people are good people, and that's what we have to hopefully hang on to in order to overcome these strange, maddening times that we're in at the moment.
Thanks, Ike. It's only right that the final word goes to Dennis from our hosts at University of Derby.
Well, this is not the university's position, I have to say. No. Well, it's interesting we start to talk about boundaries and targeted interventions against free speech. Who will make those interventions? It won't be you. I think that's a really worrying thing. It'll always be the state. And Sandy's right to remind us of things, but the thing that haunts me is the 16th of October 2020 and the beheading of Samuel Paty in Paris, right, which everybody ignored, every university, every media outlet, every trade union. And this year, for the anniversary, they only mention it. We got a special article on the AFAF website written by somebody who lives in France. Nobody else mentioned it. There was no talk about that. There was total silence and many other things. And that's the beheading of a teacher at the time when everybody is... we still have in universities days about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, right? So that there was never any debate about that, and that's the real worry. So my message is, and it's coming out, I think we've got a bit of a consensus here, the way forward is debate and discussion. That is really, to me, that's the new politics. Because unless you have debate and discussion, you won't know what you can put forward. So everybody's saying, what will we do about this? What will we do about that? Unless you've got a pre-prepared solution, the real answer is, let's sit down and discuss it, preferably face-to-face, but in any way you can. Because debate is the way that will show us the way to the future.
Can we thank the panel, please?